I think that this country can do more. The only way to solve this problem is by a united European response, and that means sharing responsibility for appalling suffering. This is a humanitarian crisis that Europe has not experienced in our time, of a dimension which demands a common response. And at the moment, it is certainly true to say that a number of countries are massively bearing the burden of this. Sweden, Germany, Italy, France, there are a number of countries that are taking significantly more by way of refugees per million people population on relative terms. And I think that part of the solution has to be a European common response, and that the idea of quotas or sharing this is a good one.
Wouldn't you feel more proud if Peter Sutherland had named Britain in those countries sharing that burden?
Well, the important thing is that the burden should be shared across Europe. And although Britain is not taking a large number of refugees, we are providing an immense amount of humanitarian support, both in Syria and to the people who've often under gunfire come over the border into the surrounding countries. Were Britain not providing that support, there would be yet more hundreds of thousands of people coming out of that part of the world towards Europe. So Britain is playing an enormously important part. I think it would be fair to say that in terms of support for those who've come out of Syria and who are in the camps in the surrounding countries, Britain has done more than the whole of the rest of the European Union put together in terms of financial support. So let's be clear that Britain is sharing the burden, though we take our share in a slightly different way from Germany and from Sweden.
Peter Sutherland, it's not about the numbers coming in then?
Well, first of all, let me answer that. There are all sorts of arguments about who's giving most. There are arguments about the EU budget in regard to development, which the British position has been negative about. I'm not going to get involved in that. The real issue here is people who are suffering. And no amount of talk about what support can or should be given in development aid overcomes the fact that we are suffering enormous deaths in the Mediterranean and enormous numbers of migrants flooding across Europe, who, most of whom, are refugees. That is, people who are escaping from persecution.
Let's just deal with some of those numbers. The tens of thousands in the Mediterranean drowned, the 3,000 at Calais, the 3,000 that we know arrive at Budapest every day. Do you hear those numbers and think...
Of course, and we all grieve at the catastrophe that has overtaken Syria and the Middle East. But let us be clear, Britain is making an immense contribution. It's not, Peter, about, development aid. It's about the hard cash that Britain has put into the camps, into humanitarian resources, helping the hundreds of thousands of people who, thanks to British aid, are alive and being supported in those camps. If we hadn't done that, those people too would have been crossing the Mediterranean and coming in a leaky boat in the hands of the modern equivalent of the slave trader to a European shore. Now,
well, they are doing that, though.
But there will be hundreds and thousands more, but for the British work in the Middle East.
So is the argument that you cannot just encourage more people to leave the countries that they should be closest to?
My argument is that hundreds of thousands of people are escaping persecution. This is a humanitarian crisis, and they have to be handled. And that is the issue for us tonight. Who is going to handle them, and are we going to share out the responsibility? The huge numbers that arrive in Italy and Greece.
OK, so share out the responsibility means what sort of number? If Germany, with a population of 80 million and a bigger landmass, is taking 800,000, is there a figure for the UK?
That's not the answer. I mean, the answer
But I'm just asking, Peter Sutherland, if you think that there is a correlation between the landmass or the number of people and the number we should be taking.
There has to be a figure, but that figure has to be based on a number of considerations which the European Commission has said should be taken into account. Population, unemployment levels, GDP per capita. And that has to be the basis of a fair allocation of responsibility across borders, so we can all fairly say that Europe is sharing in a solution. Otherwise, we're going to divide.
And you know, Andrew Mitchell, as International Development Secretary, that every time we miss a horror, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's Srebrenica, we stand and look back and we say, never forget and never again. What if this is one of those moments?
Well, let us be in no doubt at all that Britain is bearing its fair share of the burden, for the reasons which I have said. And let us also remember that many of these people
But do you not think the Prime Minister or his Cabinet will look back and say, we got this wrong? We should have just said this was a crisis moment and we had to give those people asylum.
If errors have been made, they have been made by the international community in not dealing with the causes of this crisis, which is the catastrophe that has overtaken Syria. We are dealing now with the symptoms of this, these poor, desperate people fleeing from bloodshed and conflict towards Europe. And Britain is making its contribution in the way that I have described. What Europe needs to do is to ensure that we have proper reception facilities in Greece and in Italy, where all those who are coming through can be sheltered, they can be fed, they can receive the medicine they need, and they can be processed. And that will have the benefit not only of ensuring that they're looked after, but also of sending a signal back to the countries from which they come.
Presumably,
But they
that
won't
has to be
necessarily
right.
be able to stay here.
I have been in some of the camps in Italy. I know what they're doing in Italy. They are trying to deal with a huge influx across the Mediterranean. We have to share that burden.
But when you say share, where does that stop? Do we take the 3,000 in Calais today and then the 3,000 in Calais tomorrow?
Where it stops is when the crisis stops. But as long as we have people who are escaping from persecution, who are dying in their thousand, we save them and we don't get into a figures game. This is a humanitarian crisis where they have to be saved and they have to be given the opportunity to live. And that has to be shared.
Is this a moment of moral obligation, quite simply?
Britain is acquitting its moral obligations correctly in the hundreds of thousands of people who have come out of Syria, come out of this war zone, and who, thanks to British aid and support, are being fed and sheltered and looked after today. Most of the people who are coming across the sea and who are coming out of Syria into these camps, they don't want to recreate Syria in Europe. They want to go back to their homes from which they've come. And that is why the whole international community, all parts of it, needs to tackle the cause of all of this, which is in Syria. We are today dealing with these dreadful symptoms which you have described.
Thank you. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you for coming in.